Hello, I'm Phil Goode, Mayor of Prescott, Arizona, and today we're at the Sharlot Hall MUseum with Executive Director Dr. Lisa Hayes. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning. Welcome.
So, Dr. Hayes, I imagine that many in Prescott don't know you well, and I believe you've been here at Sharlot Hall MUseum for a little over a year. Is that accurate?
Yes, I arrived in December of 2020 and have been very busy since. I arrived from Maryland after a 2,300-mile drive with a 35-pound dog on my lap.
Well, happy anniversary to you.
Thank you.
Please give us a little background on why you chose to come to this community. What were the factors that helped you make that decision?
Well, a little bit about myself. I was an actress and a playwright before going back to school and getting a PhD in American Studies, which led me to this new career in public history and museums. And for many years, I was the head of a nonprofit in Maryland that took care of a living history colonial farm museum. And then when I'd left there and was looking for a new adventure, my husband and I really wanted to get out of the DC area. And I interviewed for museum leadership positions in places all over the country, but this was the one that was meant to be. It's a real feeling of community, and it's a museum founded by a remarkable woman.
Indeed, and of course that's thousands of miles in distance, but probably a close connection to our nation's history and of course the history of Arizona and the history of Prescott.
Oh, yes.
So we're very glad that you're here, and I'm sure Sharlot Hall herself probably would be very pleased to find another woman leading the way at this museum.
I like to think so. I did some research and learned that I am the first woman to be at the helm since the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Well, let's go back to that area. It's great that you're here, and tell us about Sharlot Hall herself. When did she move to Prescott, and what made her start this museum?
Sharlot was 12 years old when she arrived with her family by covered wagon in 1883 from Kansas. And they had a ranch out near Dewey. And one year she came into town and worked for her board so that she could go to school. And while she was here, she met Henry Fleury, who was living here in this, what used to be the territorial capital of Arizona,
Right.
The governor's mansion. And he told her stories of old Arizona. And she just became fascinated with the stories and the history. And that kind of led to her lifelong passion for history and collecting stories and preserving the lifeways of the pioneers. She collected things. She had quite her own collection of artifacts. That led eventually to, she was an editor with Out West magazine, Charles Lummis. So she spent some time in LA and got to know the Southwest Museum there. And this is what she wanted. She wanted to be able to put this collection of artifacts and tell those stories.
Well, she was a incredibly remarkable young woman, and to be able to have that understanding of history, being able to collect all these examples of early Arizona here and be able to have the vision to make sure that they were preserved is just, it's really quite amazing to me. We knew that she was quite a prolific writer, as you said. Do you find that it helps to understand kind of what she wanted to do by reading some of her writings and being able to understand the culture that she was living in at the time?
Definitely. And we refer to her writings all the time to help guide us in what we do here, to be sure we're honoring her vision. And I'm happy to say that we have a very talented theater student from Yavapai College working with us now, and she does living history, portraying Sharlot Hall as a young woman, and uses a lot of her writings. So we have the way to share a lot of Charlotte's writings with the public who come to visit.
Yeah, I know people, when they first come here, sometimes confuse the name Sharlot Hall with the museum itself.
Right.
They think this is a hall by the name of Charlotte,
Yes.
instead of realizing that that was her name and she
Right.
created this museum.
Sharlot Hall should be a lot more famous because she was a rancher and a writer and a preservationist and created this museum. She got into politics.
Oh, yeah.
She was just a remarkable woman that should be known nationally.
In a book of her collected writings called Charlotte Herself, it recounts that the city council gave Charlotte a life lease on the governor's mansion and the grounds, and I imagine today it would be a very tough sell to be able to pull that off politically and locally. Do you think it was difficult for her to convince people to let her restore the governor's mansion and begin the museum?
Well, if you think about it, the state of Arizona gave the city of Prescott $7,000 to buy the governor's mansion, to preserve it, with the understanding that they would take care of it. Well, the state didn't allocate any money to do that or to make any renovations. And here comes Charlotte, who's always been talking about fixing up the mansion and making a museum. And she's willing to take on that responsibility for this life lease and raising the money and making sure the work gets done and taking care of the place.
Yeah, when you consider all those challenges, it's just amazing and remarkable that she was able to achieve all that, considering the kind of individual responsibility she took on and the amount of work that she was able to do and to result in this spectacular museum. She wrote that when she moved in, the water pipes were busted, the electricity wires were too dangerous to use. First, it appears she tackled cleaning the walls and the ceiling, which were covered with soot and grime. And I thought it was amusing that she mentioned that the mayor called on me, and though he is a garage owner and fixes the insides of cars with his own hands, he backed off from shaking my hand because it was as black as his, and I couldn't blame him.
Yeah, she did a lot of this work herself. So she was the one scrubbing 64 years of dirt and grime off the walls, and people would come by to watch her work.
Yeah, I know it must have been extremely difficult for Charlotte to transition from the project of restoring the mansion to opening a museum that people could visit and view the collections and learn the history of the community.
Well, it's not like it was all done at once. It happened in stages. She opened the doors and welcomed the first visitors to the museum in June of 1928.
Now, wasn't the governor's mansion on the other side of Granite Creek?
No, this is where the governor's mansion has always been. Some of the other buildings here on the campus have been moved.
Were moved.
Right, but
Right.
not the governor's mansion. It has always
Yeah, that would
been
have
here.
been, that would have been too big of a job to pull
It
off,
would
for
have been
sure.
big. So she would do some work, whatever she could afford, and then when she ran out of money, she'd stop and earn some more money somehow, and then do the next stage of the work. And that's kind of how we operate today. You do what you can with what you have, and then you raise more money and then do the next thing that you need to do.
So that's a good transition into the next question about bringing us up to date of what the museum is working on and doing today, especially since the founding of it was over 90 years ago.
Well, obviously we have a lot of ongoing maintenance of these buildings. The campus has grown from this one building to a 4-acre campus with 11 exhibit buildings, several of which are historic.
Well, this might be a great time for us to take a break and maybe take a tour of the grounds and have you show us what the museum is all about today.
That would be great.
Well, tell us about some of the exhibits and collections. I notice you have some permanent exhibits and rotating exhibits. What's the difference in the two, and why were some chosen to be permanent and not others?
Well, actually, no exhibit is ever permanent. What we call our permanent exhibit are the ones that stay for quite a while, that have been carefully curated and built and tell the core stories of this that we are interpreting here at the museum. So, of course, here in the governor's mansion, we interpret the territorial capital of Arizona, and it's set up as it was when the McCormicks lived here. Then we go to the Sharlot Hall building, and in the Sharlot Hall building is a permanent exhibit that shows how mining is what brought people to Arizona, and the mining then led to the military coming, and the military needed to be fed and taken care of, so that led to the ranchers coming and the railroad, and so a lot of those stories are told in the Sharlot Hall building. This is our Sharlot Hall building. And at this point, I am going to introduce our curator, Kylan Cummings, who can tell us a little bit about the building and the exhibits here.
So this is the Sharlot Hall building, and this is what we consider our main permanent exhibit space. It talks about the founding of Prescott and just kind of why Prescott's here. It highlights the mining history, the military history, ranching, fires, and just everyday town life in Prescott. So this is the 1888 trophy won by Juan Levis. This, amongst some other evidence, is the reason why Prescott claims the world's oldest rodeo. Juan Levis won it in 1888 for roping and tying steer. H.D. Aiken recognized it because he was the rodeo secretary in 1888, saved it, gave it to Grace Sparks, who had it in her office in the courthouse until 1945. So this is our Baskets Keep Talking exhibit. This was a partnership we did with the Yavapai Prescott Indian tribe. Everything in this exhibit was vetted and approved by the tribe because we wanted to make sure to tell their story in their own words and how they want to be represented. You'll notice the low lighting in this exhibit, and it's because of the organic material of the baskets. They're really susceptible to light damage. You can actually see in some of them that the black is faded already, and that's just from everyday use before it came to the museum.
Then we have a whole living history area where you can see a printing shop, a mercantile, a blacksmith shop, a reproduction of a one-room schoolhouse, Fort Misery, which is the oldest log cabin in Arizona, that was a store and then a boarding house, and then a law office. And then we have a reproduction of a ranch house. So this is the reproduction ranch house. Sharlot really wanted to show how the ranchers lived. So they were all living in one room, and the audio in these buildings that helps tell the story of the building, that was funded also by the DAR. Those buildings really make up the core of where we do Living History the second Saturday of every month, where you see costumed interpreters giving visitors an opportunity to see what life was like then and experience some of it. Now we'll stroll through the rose garden, which you have to come back and see when the roses are in bloom. Yeah. The history of them wanting to do a rose garden comes from the fact that I believe it was Margaret McCormick, the wife of the territorial governor, brought a clipping of a rose bush and planted it at in front of the governor's mansion. So I think perhaps
and the rest is history?
The rest is history. And of course, this is where you enter. It was built to look like a little bit like a train depot because we have
kind
the
of a
restored
ticket office or something for a train depot.
We have a restored railroad car out in front. Mm-hmm. This is the Fremont House, where John C. Fremont and his family lived. And we'll go in. There's a docent in there.
When the Fremonts moved here, our 5th territorial governor, we know a lot about the house because daughter Lily had a diary. She described rich red carpeting in the house. Well, we got rich red industrial carpeting here. So everything you see in here today was donated by local Prescott residents, but it's of the era of when the Fremonts were here.
Well, John C. Fremont was the first Republican candidate for president.
Yes, he was.
1856, I believe. Mm-hmm. He lost that race, and subsequently Abraham Lincoln then became the next presidential nominee and won the race in 1860.
So this was the governor's bedroom. Now, in here, the one thing that amazes me the most that I tell everybody is you look right here on this chair and you find a portable desk. That was built by a Prescott High School student in 1884 as a school project.
Wow.
What I find so amazing is we didn't have electricity, didn't have Dremel tools, and he did it all by hand. This was daughter Lily's room. Now, one of the reasons why I like to show this room is this is noted as the East Lake style of furnishings. Now, it's noted for that because if you notice at the headboard, there's burl up there. Yeah. It's also down here at the footboard, over there on the dresser, and on the nightstand. Now, all of this furnishings obviously came here after we had railroads, and it was built in Ohio. This was her room. We've pretty much set it up like what we think she would have had back then. Because she did have a diary, we've got a desk over here, so she had a place to write her notes.
Our main museum center is the Lawler Museum Center, and that is the building that visitors go to first. It's the brick building. We have the prehistory wing, which tells the story of from the beasts that, the dinosaur era to when indigenous people came here and how the landscape evolved. And then we have where we have a lot of our rotating exhibits. Right now, the temporary exhibit is our toys exhibit, toys. It's not all fun and games. And that's been extremely popular with young and old alike. Mm-hmm. So we have that temporary exhibit. So this is Toys Through History.
Lincoln Logs. I had Lincoln Logs when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Loved playing with those, yeah. Tinker Toys too.
Tinker Toys. We are about to begin a project called What's Your Toy Story? We have a grant from the Arizona Humanities Council where we'll be encouraging people to share what these toys, the stories that spring to mind inspired by those toys. So this is our small exhibit about the USS Arizona in recognition of the Pearl Harbor Day. We put it up. I just find it fascinating how effective even a small exhibit like this can be telling a story.
And having a piece of the superstructure there certainly connects the story with the reality of it.
Yeah, it gives me goosebumps. In our transportation building, you can see all the examples of transportation from our history, from bicycles and buggies to a stagecoach, a reproduction covered wagon, and Sharlot Hall's car, which is quite remarkable. So this is our transportation building. My favorite things in here are, of course, this stagecoach, which is so cool. And apparently there's a great story behind this stagecoach. It was going north from Tucson with $25,000 worth of silver from the mines. It was attacked by bandits, like 10 miles north of Tombstone, and a couple of men were killed. And the driver of the stagecoach whipped the horses and they got out of there, so they kept the silver, but they rounded up a posse to go after the culprits. And the posse was the Earps and Bat Masterson.
Wow.
And when they confronted it was cowboys from a ranch, and some of them were known to be members of the Clanton gang.
So they were part of that cowboys group that was known as really the kind of violent, lawless group of people that generated ultimately the fight at the OK Corral.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a 2/3 replica of a Conestoga covered wagon in 1976 for the bicentennial. Every state had one of these, and they drove them all to Washington, D.C.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We had a panel as part of our lecture series of women ranchers who write, and one of them was reminiscing that her grandmother came to Arizona in a covered wagon and lived to see men walk on the moon.
Yeah. Well, I reflect on my grandfather's same experience. He claims to have seen Red Cloud, the last great Sioux Plains war chief, and lived to see a man walk on the moon in one lifetime.
Wow.
It's just remarkable to experience the scope of history and the advance of technology in one lifetime like that.
Sharlot came to Arizona in a covered wagon like that, and this is the car she ended up with. You think about how the world changed.
A 1927 Durant touring car.
Right. Then we have the Bashford House, which is a wonderful example of Victorian architecture, and that's where our gift shop is.
Stu Jordan, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure
I
to meet you.
understand you work here and man the Bashford House, which I think is kind of a place for people to buy different memorabilia in their visit here. But tell us about the Bashford House
Yes,
and how it got here and a little bit of its background.
Okay, this house was built and purchased by William Coles Bashford and his wife. It was actually originally started out as a one-floor home for the first few years.
And where was it originally located?
It was actually located up where Bosa Donuts is now, on the corner of Pleasant and Gurley. Okay, and so it was expanded with a solarium, with a second floor, into the house you see now. Decorated a little bit differently, but we've kept the character of it, and it went on owned by the Bashfords for all the way till 1904, and then they moved to San Francisco, sold the home and moved to San Francisco. There's a painting of Mrs. Bashford over the fireplace there, and we have photos sprinkled around the house showing what it was like back in its heyday when the Bashfords lived here.
When did it move down the hill this
1974.
location? 74.
The solarium was moved separately, and then it was reattached to the house down here.
Oh, okay.
All in 1974.
Within 2 years, we were able to acquire the Fremont House and then the Bashford House.
That's correct. Yes, the Fremont House was not too terribly far from the
Right.
Bashford House. It was up the hill too.
Right.
Mhm.
I tell you, we're just so fortunate to be able to have the foresight to be able to acquire these historic homes, preserve them, and then make them available for the public to be able to appreciate.
Yes, sir. Wonderful treasures. These enclosed rooms off the front porch here, this was originally one long porch, outdoor porch. And then later on, after the Bashford sold the home, it became a boarding house, hotel boarding house.
Right.
And they enclosed these for outdoor kitchens. And then this room in here, it has the history of the Coles Bashford and Levi, the brothers that came here, and then William Coles Bashford, who owned this home, was his son. And Bashford Burmeister Courts across the street from the courthouse were named after them. That's where their mercantile was.
Right.
And so this room has the history of that and the history of the family, and shows photographs of the house being moved down the hill to its current location over here. So a lot of good information in here as well.
Indeed. Yeah, I always reflect on how privileged we are to be able to have all this history so close at hand. Not only the original impression that most people get when they visit the courthouse plaza, see the courthouse and Whiskey Row, but all these other great homes and history that really fills in a broad spectrum of the history of the city and really the state. It's a great opportunity to be able to be exposed to all this history. I just love it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
It's a great museum, and everybody comes in here seems to love it, and
Yeah.
learning about the area and about the people who lived here in the beginning.
Well, I know people who lived here for years and they've never even visited the museum. They just have maybe a preconceived idea of what a museum is all about.
Absolutely.
And this is so much more legitimate and rich.
Sure
It's
thing.
not a picture of something that's of historical. It's the actual buildings and the artifacts and the furnishings and everything else that brings it to life.
Yes, sir. And this area of the museum store is primarily our book area. A lot of interesting books in here, even a section on cookbooks for the Southwest cooking. Military books. Some of these authors are Prescott residents, so they do quite a bit of publishing, and we try to keep their books.
Parker Anderson has published several of those books about the history of Prescott.
This author, Bradley Courtney,
Oh,
he
I
was
know
here,
Brad.
yes, signing his
Yeah,
books.
he's
and-
done a lot of presentations here about the history of Whiskey Row and parts of that history around the time of the big fire in
Big fire.
1900.
Did a whole
Yeah.
book on that. It's a very good book. Yeah. This solarium, everybody who comes into the museum loves the solarium. Everybody I've talked to who comes here to visit said, wow, I wish I had that in my house, because
Right.
it's a sunny room. It dualed as a kind of a sunroom as well as a greenhouse. Photo over here that's on this table, you can see that the Bashfords had it decorated as kind of a greenhouse. So that's the original room, the original glass. That is the original urn, 800 pounds. So when it was moved down here in 1974 and they brought the urn back in, that being 800 pounds, they didn't want it to crash through the floor, so they had to reinforce the floor, make sure it doesn't.
What is that? Is that marble?
I don't know if it's granite or marble.
Kind of looks like
It's
it.
in marble, yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's kind of a good news, bad news story. Well, the good news is I got you your urn. The bad news is you're going to have to rebuild the whole floor to be able to support it.
And nobody's ever going to move it again. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's a real
It's
attraction
kind of
there.
special, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, everybody comes in here, man, woman, and child migrates out there. So,
Yeah, it
wow.
kind of just draws you into the room, doesn't it?
Sure does.
Yeah. Well, we certainly appreciate the time, Stu, to be here, and here's another example of a great historical home and the opportunity to visit this and appreciate the wonderful history we have here at the Sharlot Hall Museum. Hi, I'm Mayor Phil Goode, and I'm here with Dr. Lisa Hayes from the Sharlot Hall Museum. We had quite a fascinating tour of the grounds before the break, and now we're back to have some further discussions. Of course, we're still in the second year of the impact of the COVID pandemic. Can you describe how it's affected the museum over the past 2 years?
Oh, it's been a long 2 years, hasn't it, for
Yes,
everyone? We, like everyone, were closed for a short time. Unlike a lot of museums, we did open up quickly. We put in safety protocols. Everybody was masked. We have a more stringent cleaning protocol that's in place now. We lost a lot of income from admissions, but our supporters were great in stepping up and helping us keep things alive here. The museum has an interesting financial model in that this is a very impressive public-private partnership.
Indeed.
Between the state of Arizona and the Sharlot Hall Historical Society. So in the 1960s, I believe, don't quote me on that, the Prescott Historical Society became an agency of the state of Arizona. So there is an appropriation made every year by the state of Arizona. We don't ever see the money directly, but it pays the salaries of 11 of our staff members.
Oh, that's great.
And provides some capital expenses every year, because the state now owns all of the museum's buildings here.
Well, it's certainly a great addition to the state's ability to provide this historical perspective to Arizonans, and certainly people from around the world come to Arizona and come to Prescott to experience the true genesis of the Old West. Managing some of these events and being able to keep activity going here at Sharlot Hall Museum during the pandemic certainly, as you mentioned, had an impact on revenue. But I know you've continued to put programs together. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, of course, during the height of the pandemic, we had to cancel a number of our festivals. But as things have come back, we eliminated our folk arts festival and our folk music festival. It wasn't prudent to do them last year because of the pandemic. And in doing the analysis, those two events weren't bringing in the kind of income and attendance that would warrant the amount of staff time invested. Mm-hmm. So we shifted and began weaving more of our folk arts festival into the monthly living history programs. So essentially, instead of having one folk arts festival a year where everything is dependent on how the weather is that one weekend, we have kind of expanded the experience for visitors weekly or monthly.
Boy, what a challenge you took on. I'm sure you didn't realize quite the magnitude of not only becoming the new executive director and making sure you understood all the historical characteristics of this, but then have to deal with keeping the museum operating successfully through an unprecedented health crisis that we are still dealing with.
Yes.
Now, you touched on some of the educational programs that we during the tour. Can you tell us anything in addition to your plans for educational programs here?
We also have educational tours for school groups, which of course died off during the pandemic, and we're just beginning to see schools able to come back, although we know how the school situation is. We are going to be doing collaborating with the Launchpad on a teen curation project, where the Launchpad teens will be learning how to curate an exhibit.
You know, I constantly reflect on Sharlot Hall's appreciation for history and being able to make sure that everything she could possibly collect that was related to not only her time, but clearly times past. So she talked to a lot of the old timers, and I think a lot of folks like that sometimes dismiss the value of the material that they've saved or kept for whatever reason. And then she was able to acquire those and collect them even before the state stepped in and started to support some of her efforts. So can you talk about what may have been lost had she not been so diligent in preserving everything that we have the privilege to see today?
We would have lost the way to tell the stories of our ancestors. Can you imagine if this building had been torn down, or if the Fremont House or the Bashford had been just raised like they were destined to be until people stepped up and helped fund moving them here? But that is actually an excellent segue to something I wanted to mention, in that our library and archives has millions of documents and photographs that have been preserved, and oral histories. It's a wonderful place for people to come and the public can come and do research there. And if you have a relative who has a great story to tell about early Arizona, you should be in touch with us so we can make sure we record that. So, because those stories get lost if they're not told and recorded. And our collection, we have a 40,000 object collection, most of which is in storage. And of course, a lot of those items did not come from Sharlot Hall. They came from Sharlot Hall's legacy. They came from people through the years bringing their objects to us and saying, is this something you might want? Of course, there are very strict rules around what we will accept and won't accept, because we don't have unlimited storage. But if you're wondering whether something you have in the garage that you were ready to just send to Goodwill or throw in the trash, think about it for a minute. It might be worthy of preserving, and it might fill a hole we have.
That old saying that one man's trash is another man's treasure
yeah.
certainly applies
Definitely.
To that comment. Now, you touched a little bit on funding and how the museum is able to maintain its operations. Any projections for future funding and future building projects or capital projects? I know you have so much archive material here, and being able to have that available and accessible sometimes isn't even seen.
The Sharlot Hall Historical Society is the nonprofit arm and is the one that raises private funds. It's the Sharlot Hall Historical Society that raised the $3 million or over $3 million to build the new education center. We want to renovate our museum center so we have more exhibit space. I personally would love to see us there was a master plan done like in 2000, but that's 20 years ago, and a lot of things have changed. So like have a master plan of how we want the visitor to experience this campus and where are the best places to create exhibit areas so we can show more of our collection. So there's lots of opportunities. So if you have money, send it to us.
Well, I think we're nearing the end of this segment. Is there any additional information or something we haven't touched on that you'd like to present or discuss with the public?
Oh, just one other thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned is that the heart of our organization is volunteers. We have over 350 volunteers here. They go through a training program, and then they are the ones that staff our buildings so that visitors, when they come in, they have somebody knowledgeable there who can answer their questions about what's on exhibit, the history of the building and the history of that era that's being portrayed. So if you want to volunteer, in February is the beginning of our volunteer training program, which is a bi-weekly 1.5-hour session where we cover one aspect of the history of Arizona and the things that we have here at the museum in those sessions. So those sessions go into September. They go from February through September. Our volunteers also help care for the grounds. We have a remarkable landscape with a gorgeous rose garden, the Territorial Women's Memorial Rose Garden, which there are over 500 women being recognized and honored from Arizona's territorial period by those roses. So there are lots of different opportunities for volunteering here.
Well, I want to complete this segment by thanking you for inviting us to be here today, and I hope everyone after listening to this will realize what just an absolute jewel we have here in the city of Prescott, and to spend time and come and explore all the exhibits and the information and the artifacts that you have a chance to see here. It really gives you appreciation for the history of Prescott and really the history of the state itself. I'm Mayor Phil Goode, and this has been Prescott Today. Thanks for watching.